Hello, the world is a very different place since we last recorded an annual outlook in this studio a year ago. So what lies ahead in 2021? Dialing in from their homes to discuss the risks and opportunities in this new reality are Salman Ahmed, Global Head of Macro, Fidelity's Chief Executive Officer Anne Richards, and Chief Investment Officer Andrew McCaffery. Well, welcome to you all. Anne, 2020 was a year full of upheaval and uncertainty. Is there anything that we can be certain about in 2021?
Well, we can be certain that winter will turn into spring, or indeed summer into autumn in the southern hemisphere. Beyond that, if you look at the pattern of 2020, and the three big things of this year were COVID, the climate, and of course the US presidential election. We now have a new president-elect, and that will really, I think, set the scene for quite a lot of change as we go into 2021 on the first two topics, on the approach to COVID and on the approach to climate. And I think one of the real differences that we will see in 2021 is that much more of a return, of a renewal to a multilateral approach to dealing with some of these really big issues, because that's one of the defining differences, frankly, of the two campaigns that we saw through the presidential election process.
On climate change, we've perhaps been focused on COVID in 2020, but climate change, I imagine, will come back into the fore in the coming year. What's the role of asset managers there?
I think asset owners and asset managers have in general continued to move forward on the climate agenda, perhaps running ahead of government in many instances. And what you're seeing now is a coming together of the fact that the response to the climate crisis and the investment in infrastructure, in green infrastructure, on some of these broader sustainability issues, in fact, is being seen as part of the rebuilding that is necessary of the economy in response to the COVID crisis. So you're actually seeing a coming together of these two issues. And that, I think, has been led by the asset owners, by the asset managers, forming the debate that government and policy makers are now in the process of catching up with. And the fact that we've got a renewed multilateral approach, we believe, coming from the US, means that there will be more of the key people around the table in order to really drive that agenda forward in 2021.
Andrew, this sustainable investing, there have been concerns that it comes at the cost of financial returns, but your team has research which suggests that's not the case.
No, it isn't. We started during the peak of the initial COVID crisis, when markets were trading in very, very difficult fashion. How did the better ESG rated firms perform during that period? And we found that they did extremely well.
And briefly, the attention that Anne talked about, refocusing on climate change, the fact that it makes financial sense as well, as you're saying, does that mean that now is the time for a significant shift in strategic asset allocation? So the way investors allocate over the long term?
I believe it is. I think you've got to see it in the context of thinking about how climate change may impact a portfolio from a risk perspective, which has always been built in, but also to drive returns as you see capital seeking out very much a reallocation to try and capture what is going to be enormous value as we see increase in the climate change focus in the years ahead.
So Salman, a very dynamic picture, as we've just heard. That makes your task all the trickier. You've got to try and paint a macroeconomic picture for the year ahead. What are your forecasts?
Well, to be fair with you, I think the new regimes and macroeconomic, frameworks is not to do point forecast. And I think I will go back to your comments earlier on that when we were thinking about the outlooks last year. I think right now, given that we are in an on-off economy, I think we have to be very careful, at least in the near term, as we pass through the pandemic. And this differentiation between the globe is actually becoming even more starker and stronger, as we see that China is doing really, really well at the moment, as it contained the virus very well, while Europe has been under pressure and may see a rebound in the near term. But US is the one, at least in the very short term, where we may see a loss in momentum. The IMF has come up with a global forecast of 5.2% for the global economy. And we think the risks are balanced on that forecast, but we will see incredible amount of heterogeneity as we move forward into 2021.
So a lot of risks, Andrew. Do you think that markets are overvalued given the uncertainty that there is?
I think that there are pockets of overvaluation that we've seen developing, and a lot of that has been driven by the policy initiatives and the concentration where we've seen leadership for some of the markets. And it's been interesting as we've gone into a post-election period that the narrative so quickly latched onto the positives again. In reality, I think that we're actually quite close to sort of peak optimism in certain parts of the market, and that may feed through the broader environment. So it is one where I think that as we look to 2021, that optimism needs to have the sort of matching with the reality that we don't have the mistakes. We have good execution, we have follow through in policy initiatives that are constructive, and that will be the challenge that we face as 2021 rolls out.
Thank you, Andrew. Now, Salman, Andrew mentions there fiscal and monetary stimulus. We were expecting a lot of fiscal stimulus, but it doesn't look like Joe Biden will have the clean sweep that was predicted by some. How much does that hamper him and the US economy?
And it has massive implications on the size and scope of fiscal policy. In fact, our estimates are that in case of a big DEM sweep, we could have anywhere between $8 trillion of fiscal stimulus over the next 4 years, whilst in the current scenario, we are envisaging anywhere between 1.5 to 2 trillion. So a significant notch down in expectations. This is going to have very important implications both on near-term implications for US growth, because fiscal policy is so important, and also how quickly the US economy will reach pre-pandemic levels. And one point I would mention related to fiscal policy is that, as Anne mentioned, there is a certainty around the seasons. And in addition, on the macro side, one thing is very, very certain is debt. Our global public debt ratios are now surpassing World War II levels. And how that load is resolved is going to be a critical factor going forward beyond 2021 as well.
Well, perhaps it brings us to the other two certainties, according to Ben Franklin, death and taxes. At least one of them might be relevant. Anne, a last word to you. In this world that all three of you have painted, there's a lot of uncertainty there, as we've discussed. What are the countries, what are the companies that are going to succeed in 2021?
Well, I'm not going to give you a prediction on individual countries or individual companies, but I'm going to tell you some common themes that there are to those that will succeed. And the first is around survivability. If you focus on what you need to survive, it really frames the planning that you do and the thinking that you do around your strategy. It leads to things like effective diversification, but not proliferation, for example, at a corporate level. So when you think about survivability, when you think about the strength of the economy, you are thinking about sustainability. What is there in the economy? What is there in the business that really allows you to continue to evolve, to continue to perform year after year after year? And then there is resilience. How can you make sure that you don't have those single points of failure, that you have a plan B? Resilience is all about having a plan B. And I think the economies that get through this and the companies that get through this are those who can demonstrate that combination of a focus on a long-term sustainability agenda and a focus on the resilience that you need to make sure that you can keep that sustainable agenda on track.
Anne, Andrew, Salman, thank you all very much indeed. So there you have it, a plan B. You need one, but there are some pockets for optimism. For much more on our outlook for 2021, you can go to our website for in-depth written material. And if podcasts are your thing, search for Rich Pickings on your podcast app, and you'll find a longer discussion at asset class level on what the coming year has in store. Goodbye.